Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In this bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Mike Rapport. We talk about his latest book, City of Light, City of Shadow, Paris, and the Bellé Epoch. So this book follows roughly, I would say, every type of history and culture you can imagine in the city of Paris between, let's say, roughly 1875 and 1920, or maybe the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. It's a fascinating study because you get culture, you get art, you get science, you get literature, you get architecture, you get everything that we think of, well, when we think of Paris. And honestly, the book couldn't be better timed. It's out today, and with the Olympics now just a month or so away, be a great time to brush up on everything that is Paris. As always, the link to purchase the book is in the show notes, and if you're so inclined, feel free to click there and support one of our many great authors. So then, without further ado, let's move on to the interview. Welcome back. As I mentioned before, sitting down here with historian Mike Rapport, and we're talking about his newest book, City of Light, City of Shadows. It's available today. It's a fascinating read that's really kind of a combination of, I would say, history, architecture, culture, all these things kind of wound into one. And I wanted to start out with our first question by asking kind of about, you worked the book by introducing four important figures that feature in the narrative as the structure of the book continues. And this helps us tell the story of Paris in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I thought you could start out by maybe telling us, first of all, who these four people are, because they're very different. And then why did you choose them to structure the narrative in such a way? Because I think they bring a lot to the story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on. First of all, the first character is Émile Zola, who was one of France's greatest novelists and certainly one of the greatest novels of the period. And he wrote a lot about Paris. Many of his novels were actually set during the Second Empire, so the period that ends in 1870, so the period that precedes what I'm looking at, the period the book looks at. But actually, a lot of the time, he's talking about his own contemporary concerns, the concerns of his own period. So he's very, very interesting in that respect as a form of social observation. And that was partly the style of his writing was to really do his research very, very deeply and to get to actually do the footwork, to visit the places he describes and to speak to people and to observe and to take quite meticulous notes. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The second character was Marguerite Durand, and she was an actress, apparently very stunning for her own day, very beautiful for her own day, and people remarked on that. But she was also a feminist. She started off actually working when she left acting, she became a political journalist, and she was sent by her editor to cover a feminist congress. This is in the early 1890s. And was told, you've got to satirize it. You've got to pull fun at it. I want an article which really kind of demolishes it with humor. And the more she listened to the arguments of the delegates at this feminist conference, the more she was convinced by the arguments. So she herself then founded a newspaper for women, by women, produced entirely by women, called La Fronde, which first appeared in 1894. So it was a very, very important publication, and it gives a very much a strongly kind of feminist perspective and a women's perspective on Paris at this point in time. The third character was a Vietnamese diplomat, Nguyen Trong Hiep. So what that gives you, because the narrative is a kind of view from the French Empire, Vietnam being part of Indochine, Indochina at the time, part of the wider French Empire. And I think it's important to have that kind of voice from the empire, from France's, for want of a better word, imperial subjects, if you like, looking in at the French Republic, because of course it's a bit of a contradiction. Here we have a self-proclaimed democratic republic, which also has an empire. having a republic and empire is a bit of a contradiction in terms. And what is fascinating about Hiep's writing, it's a series of poems about Paris. And Hiep is talking really about, quite ironically at times, I think, most of the time he praises the city and how wonderful it is, but every now and again, reading in between the lines, you know that he's saying things that actually, is France so superior to everywhere else? Are we really? So he's a very interesting witness, very much an elite person. I mean, he was very close to the monarchy in Vietnam and all that, had been part of the resistance against French rule. So he comes from a very interesting perspective. And the final character is Jean Jaurès, who was a French Republican, socialist, social democratic politician, very prolific writer, a great historian. He himself wrote a history of the French Revolution. So what's not to like? That's my other period. One of my other periods, I should say. He's a writer, he's an historian, he's a journalist. He founded the French newspaper L'Humanité. And so he doesn't talk much about Paris itself as a site, as a place. But he does engage, like Émile Zola, in fact, he does engage a lot with the controversies of the day, obviously, as a politician. And so all four together gives you a range of perspectives, I think, on Paris and the controversies and the issues that the book examines. So I wanted to get a wide perspective of views and a different balance of views.
And I personally found the Vietnamese perspective very interesting as I was reading the book, because you're right, it's difficult to justify the ideals of the revolution and the ideals of the Second Empire and the Republic and everything that comes out of it, because at one point you're talking about, and I don't speak French, so my pronunciation here, ladies and gentlemen, will struggle, but I'll do the best I can. But égalité, being equal and fraternité and all of those things, that sounds great until you remember the fact that there's a whole ostensible French-speaking part of this wider empire that does not have the same rights and is not treated equality and with equality in any way, shape, or form. It reminds me somewhat of what we see coming out of the original French Revolution with Haiti, in that it's kind of a massive contradiction in terms. Haiti, of course, as we're recording this, is quite in the news right now. So it's one of those things that you see this, every once in a while, you see the past reaching back forward to the present to almost tap you on the shoulder and remind you, like, this is still important. Don't forget about it. And so it's important to recognize these things. And I really thought that perspective brought an extra dimension to the book that gave it a lot of extra depth, and I really enjoyed that part of it. So I thought that the four figures were all really powerful, and they feature it in the book at different parts in ways that really complement what you're talking about. But of course, one of the other things that features prominently in your work is architecture. And for those who are getting excited right now for the Summer Olympics in Paris, there will be a lot of city shots, of course, and there will be a lot of discussion about different important buildings, some of which we'll talk about here. This would be a great book, actually, to pick up, to brush up on your Paris architecture in advance of the Olympic Games coming up. But you talk about two buildings that sort of represent some of the factions in Parisian and French society that come out of the Franco-Prussian War, so that come out of the war in the early 1870s here. We've done a couple of books on that war on this podcast. And so you talk about, the Basilica of Sacred Heart. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that in French. And then, of course, the Eiffel Tower. And so I thought we could start by just talking about, how do these two buildings sort of represent this political, social divide that is going on in Paris as the 19th century is starting to give way to the 20th?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, your pronunciation's absolutely fine. The two buildings, the Sacré-Cœur, the Basilica, and the Eiffel Tower, represent two sides of what some historians call the Franco-French War. It's a term I use in the book fairly cautiously, but nonetheless. And that cultural war, cultural and political conflict, if you like, or struggle or debate, most of the time it is a debate. It's not violent, open conflict, although it sometimes erupts into this over the course of the 19th century, can be traced right way back to the French Revolution of 1789. And the problem being, of course, is that whereas 1789 ends up creating a republic, not everybody accepts that. And a lot of people still hark back to the days of the monarchy, to the days of the church, to the days of hierarchy, and so on and so forth, the days of privilege, the days of tradition, especially provincial privileges and provincial tradition, these kinds of older, longer standing traditions. So what this did was this created a division about what it meant to be French, what type of regime you wanted to have running France, what France stood for. I mean, it ran very deeply in terms of not just politics, but people's identity, people's national identity. And come the Franco-Prussian War, which you rightly reference here as the context, it was a catastrophic defeat. And a number of Catholics, especially Catholic leadership in France, thought, well, how could we fall down to such a humiliating defeat? Well, the answer is God is punishing France for its godlessness, for its atheism, for its turning away from the true traditions of the church, for the revolution and its inheritance. And therefore, the Sacré-Cœur, the original idea of the Sacré-Cœur, arose from the ashes, if you like, of the defeat at the hands of the Prussians and the Germans. And the idea being that it would be a monument of expiation. To basically, you vow, you create a national vow to which good Catholics would subscribe. And they subscribed both in terms of their devotion, but also financially as well. They gave donations to build this basilica on the Butte de Montmartre, on the hill of Montmartre. The purpose of this was that, once this vow was completed, this would be France kind of basically asking God for forgiveness, and it would be a turning back towards God. And if you visit Sacré-Cœur today, it wasn't completely completed until after the First World War. Walk inside. It's worth a visit. Walk inside and you'll see a mosaic at the back, which is complete, I think, in the 1920s. On the right-hand side, you'll see there's a whole crowd of people turning towards Christ in the center. But if you look on the far right-hand side, there is a French revolutionary sans-culotte, a French revolutionary militant with his red cap of liberty on, and he's turning away from Christ indifferent. So it's deeply symbolic that this is a rejection of the revolutionary heritage, but a turning back towards the church and tradition, and some suspected, not without reason in the 1870s, of the old monarchy, the old monarchical ways. So if you're on the left of French politics, a Republican, you kind of had to dislike the Sacré-Cœur. But if you're a monarchist, or a Catholic, or a devout Catholic, you in theory had to dislike the Eiffel Tower. Now, the Eiffel Tower was constructed in 1889 as the centerpiece for the Universal Exposition of that year in Paris in 1889. But 1889, of course, was also the centenary of the French Revolution. And so the Eiffel Tower, and Gustave Eiffel himself, the designer, the engineer who designed it, was himself absolutely explicit that the Eiffel Tower was a celebration of human reason, of rationality, of engineering, of science, of human thought, as against the traditions of religion or superstition as they saw it, as they put it, as against the old traditions. This is rather a celebration of the revolution's inheritance, of the age of enlightenment, of human reason, against religious faith and dogma, against tradition. So in a sense, the two buildings in their own day, when they were built, represented these two sides of this Franco-French war. The fact is, probably most Parisians in the end just got on with it, and they become part of the landscape. And so nowadays, I don't think people really mind too much. Every now and again, controversy blows up around the Sacré-Cœur. Especially on the more radical left, but it's quite rare. I think now it's just part of the landscape. Both buildings, has to be said, I think are quite loved. Although the Sacré-Cœur, still elicits some kind of hackles.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think these buildings can be highly symbolic for some people, but for most, it is just part of the cityscape in the end. And although, as you're talking, If the Basilica of the Sacred Heart was built, to try to atone and get a different outcome against the Germans, I suppose it worked in the First World War to an extent, as the French did do much better than they did in the Franco-Prussian War. So I guess maybe they should have kept building more basilicas. Is the lesson we should maybe take away from this if you're extremely superstitious. Now, I know this isn't an engineering book or an engineering podcast, but the section about the engineering and the construction of the Eiffel Tower is fascinating. So I was hoping you could talk about that for just a couple of minutes to give the listeners, an explanation that this is not just a bunch of pieces of steel higgledy-piggledy placed upon each other. It's actually quite precise and really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but it is fascinating. And not least because, of course, as the centerpiece of the exposition, when the exposition was planned in 1889, it was agreed that the centerpiece would be a tower of 300 meters in height. That's the specification, 300 meter tall tower. And there were lots of entries to the competition. But the challenge for that is a 300-meter tower has to be able to stand up. That's challenge number one, right? Obviously. And I think I'm right in saying that up to this point in time, the tallest freestanding structure in the Western world was the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., I think. So the Eiffel Tower at 300 meters was going to be considerably taller. So how does it stand up? And Eiffel, interestingly, chose iron. Because stone it would just probably collapse under its own weight and its own center of gravity. Very hard to make it stand up because it would just be too damn heavy. Secondly, steel would be light, but very, very it tended to bend and wind in high winds and so on if you've got too much of it. So iron seemed to be the most sensible thing, but iron's pretty dense and pretty heavy. So when you see the way the tower is built, there's these very beautiful, graceful curves, the lattice work, and the way it's all put together, it actually looks quite graceful. Some people hated it at the time. One people hated it at the time. As a blot on the landscape, but it actually, to modern eye, it looks very graceful. The sort of elegant curves. But there's a practical reason behind it as well as an aesthetic reason, and that is that it lightens the structure, and it makes it less prone to the pressures of wind resistance in high winds, so it's more likely to stand up. And in fact, Eiffel was so confident in his design that when local residents understandably said, okay, what happens if the tower collapses and our homes get crushed? What guarantee do we have that this is not going to happen? And if it does happen, what comeback do we have? And Eiffel said, look, I'll take on personal liability for this. It's fine. Don't worry. And of course, he's so far, he's been proven right. So there's a practical purpose behind its design and its shape. And actually, in terms of actually constructing it, it's meticulous, as you rightly say. There's about 18,000 different parts, all individually created and designed. And these are based on 5,000 separate drawings of the different parts. Some of them more similar than others, of course. So in the end, you needed 5,000. Only, in inverted commas, 5,000 drawings, quite meticulous. All the founding of the pieces and the boring of the holes for the bolts, all done in Eiffel's workshop at Levallois-Perret, which is a suburb northwest of the city. So there would be no actual kind of preparation work done on site. The site of the Eiffel Tower at the Champ de Mars was simply the construction site where everything was being put together almost like a toy, with the hot bolts being put in, seared in, and then hold the whole thing together. And the way the whole thing stood up as well, and the way the whole thing was pieced together too, is fascinating, because the foundations were driven into the ground, obviously, but they rested, and depending upon, some are deeper, the feet closer to the river, because the river bank obviously is sandier, more gravelly, it has to go deeper. But at the bottom of these feet, if you like, of these foundations, are like these kind of like giant bolts. in cylinders. So they act as a kind of like a piston almost, so that as the legs started to rise up to the first level, the platform of the first level, what became the first floor of the Eiffel Tower, they could be slightly adjusted so that they aligned. It's the beauty, it's the genius of the design. It's just fascinating, and so the whole thing eventually held together, and it stood up. It's a fascinating story, and one that kind of, in a sense, vindicated Eiffel's vision of this taller, lighter structure, I think.
It's so mathematically precise, and that's one of my takeaways when I was reading the book, that I just found it so fascinating, especially the part, as you were indicating, that they were only putting it together on the site. Every piece was fashioned off-site, and it fit. And it's just a level of perfection that I think is surprising, even when you look at it. But now, all you listeners, when they're showing the Eiffel Tower repeatedly this summer during the games, you'll have something to talk about. So there's something valuable. Now, of course, the other building that they'll show a lot is Notre Dame. And I loved the sort of imagined conversation or debate between those two buildings, because if you want to talk about the difference between the past and modernity, symbolized in one city, there you have it with those two buildings. So I was hoping you could tell that story for us, because it was really interesting to me.
Yes, it's an imagined dialogue between the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame, the cathedral. And in a sense, it's a dialogue reflecting this deeper cultural conflict that we've already discussed. Notre Dame says in this imagined dialogue, says to the Eiffel Tower, well, you're just a fad for a day. You're rooted in nothing. I'm rooted in tradition. I'm rooted in faith. I move people, and I inspire people because I am close to God, and so on and so forth. The Eiffel Tower responds, you're an old Gothic structure. Nobody listens to you anymore. I am the future. I am modernity, human reason, human knowledge, mathematics, science. That's what runs through my limbs. That's what's runs through my structure. The world no longer revolves around your axis, Notre Dame. It's around mine. So there's this imagined dialogue. The author actually is himself. It was Eugène Melchior de Vougué. He was an interesting character at the time. He wrote these kind of sketches. I think he called them the remarks on the Universal Exposition of 1889. He was a member of the French Academy, so he's an established writer himself. He was a travel writer. He was a diplomat. He was very keen on the Russian novel. He did a lot of stuff to promote the Russian novel in France in the late 19th century, including, I think, Dostoevsky. But he's an interesting character in himself. But he writes this actually quite an even-handed dialogue between the two, giving them both a fair shout, and he leaves it at that. There's no resolution, which is quite right, because what is the resolution between science and faith, reason and emotion, tradition and revolution, if you like. What is the solution? What is the resolution? So he leaves it at that. He doesn't really pass judgment on, come down on one side or another. But it's a lovely dialogue. Yes, I agree.
It's just such a cool story, because we don't have this as much in the United States. In some cities more than others, but in many cities there's, the oldest building maybe 100 years old, especially in the West. But in the old world of Europe, you have vaunted skyscrapers of modernity next to, potentially, depending on where you are, a medieval castle from the 10th century. Those two things can exist in the same space. And it's just an interesting dichotomy that comes together. I wanted to ask next about the metro, about the subway system in Paris, because it's interesting, because I didn't realize this until I was reading your book, but you are right. Paris came a little bit late to this game, to this subway game. And I wanted to know why that was. And you talk about it in the book, but why did they take so much longer than, say, London, for example? And there was a tremendous amount of controversy around something that just seems natural today, of course, to us because it's there, but it wasn't there at the time. So, what was so controversial about this project, and why did Parisians come so late to the game of the metro?
I think the main answer to that is gridlock, or deadlock rather, between the city of Paris and the state, the government, the national government. When the government, the French government, talked about it, and they started talking about it somewhere time around like 1855. It was under the Second Empire, under Napoleon III, long before the Third Republic. They talk about one controversy was, okay, whose purpose does it serve? Now, the city of Paris, understandably, wanted it to serve Parisians, its people. So it had to be useful for people traveling to work, traveling for tradesmen and tradeswomen, traveling between jobs at work in Paris, whatever it was they were doing. So it had to serve them, which means they wanted it to be kind of user friendly and so on for Parisians, for their leisure, their work, and so on and so forth. The state, though, the French state, wanted it to serve France's strategic interests. Because the railway network, as it was evolving in the 19th century, was pretty much focused on Paris. And actually, even today, if you look at a map of the French railway network, the big hub is Paris. The problem is Paris has lots of different railway stations. The Gare du Nord, the Gare Saint-Lazare, the Gare de l'Est, Austerlitz, Lyon, Montparnasse, right? The problem is, so the metro, as far as the government was concerned, had to basically fundamentally connecting those major railway stations to allow, say, armed forces, whatever it is, or people, goods, and so on to travel through. So that really they thought of it in terms of more like an extension of the railway line going through Paris, a kind of a cross-metropolitan railway line connecting the main rail arteries, right? Neither side could agree, so who's going to fund it, and so on and so forth. The other controversy was, well, do you want it overground or underground? Some French people, some Parisians argued that it should be overground, simply because the London underground was underground. So why should we impersonate, the old enemy, les Britanniques, les rose beef? Why should we impersonate them? We should be different. Also, I think one of the more hilarious arguments I read somewhere was, and I think as I put it in the book, was it was all very well for Londoners whose city is raining all the time in London, right? It's fog bound. So, it's all very well for them to go underground. They need to. Right, but Parisians should be able to ride and see their beautiful city and under the sun, under the good weather, because it's never grey in Paris, right? Okay, so it was a wonderful argument. In the end, what breaks the gridlock is the approach of the Universal Exposition of 1900. Both the government and the city obviously wanted it to be a success. They needed people to come in. They wanted to make it easier to get people to the Universal Exposition in the west of the city. And so in the end, the state gave way to the city of Paris and said, look, have it. It's yours. you do what you want. And that's why we get the metro pretty much as it is today.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think that at some point somebody thought about a subway system as serving a strategic military purpose. Because I don't think hardly any of us today look at any major city's metro and think, well, how's it going to move soldiers from point A to point B? That's not something that we necessarily think about. How's it going to get them from Union Station in Washington, D.C. to the other side, to Anacostia, where we can get them to the barracks? Like nobody thinks about that. That's just not even a consideration. And I did love the part in the book, by the way, where it is just Parisians saying like, well, we can't have it underground because that's what London did. And that would be giving in to the enemy. Like, that's just such an absurd thought. But that is nevertheless right. But it is nevertheless what they were thinking at the time. But yeah, so it's the exposition of 1900 that ultimately sort of breaks the gridlock. And that is, of course, what the Eiffel Tower is put together as well for as part of the exposition. These used to be a huge deal. And we're put on, from time to time. And so let's talk about that. Like, in what ways did the exposition of 1900, it is the exposition of the turn of the century, of modernity, and of everything that we want to showcase, in what ways does that sort of start to define the Paris as we think of it today?
Well, the first thing, obviously, is the metro itself. The metro existed in the way it does because of the Universal Exposition. And the other thing is the metro as well, it was its entrances had the Hector Guimard metro entrances, which are now these iconic symbols of Paris almost. There are not that many still around, unfortunately, or not as many as there used to be. There's still a number, and they're beautiful to look at. These elegant Art Nouveau, these serpentine of sort of vegetal lines with that kind of green-washed enamel, just beautiful. That they become an icon, of course, for the city itself. The other reason 1900, Universal Exposition, is rather different to 1889. 1889 celebrates a century of the French Revolution, science, engineering, all this really hardcore stuff. Whereas 1900, it was much more the focus, and a lot of people were worried about this, in fact. It was much more about the finer things in life. Fashion, above all. I mean, the centerpiece of the exposition in 1900 was the gateway designed by an Art Nouveau architect called René Binet. And Binet's sort of rather sprawling gateway was topped by a statue, La Parisienne, the Parisian lady, who was dressed in the finest haute couture. Some critics said this actually represents prostitution. But there was a very sort of strong sense that this celebrated the more decadent things. Which on the one hand, Paris is famous for, elegance, fashion. It still is one of the great fashion centers of the world. Good cuisine, the finer things in life, right? But for many Parisians and many French people who were worried, for example, about international competition, particularly with Germany, it felt like this isn't perhaps what we should be celebrating. We should be focusing much more on science, technology, and engineering. This is a mark of our decline, but nonetheless, it left its mark on what part of the image of Paris, which is the Guimard metro entrances, the Art Nouveau images, the Art Nouveau lettering, and living elegantly, living fabulously, if you like.
Well, and part of living fabulously is, of course, to be seen. And one of the aspects that people will take in France nowadays is when you go to Paris, there are these wide sweeping avenues in some places. And now that is, of course, not the Paris you would have experienced if you went during the French Revolution. There would have been these narrow streets that lended themselves very well to barricading in many ways, but didn't lend themselves sort of as well to showing off. And you write how sort of the great arc of this older, wider avenue on the right bank of the Seine allows those present to witness the vibrant face of life during this period. And I wondered if you could dig into that a little bit more and talk about what you mean.
Yeah. Oh, yes. These are what Parisians still call the Grand Boulevard. If you take the metro and you merge, there is actually a metro stop called the Grand Boulevard. These are the great boulevards. They date actually to Louis XIV in the 17th century. Louis XIV had this rather traumatic experience when he was a boy during an uprising called La Fronde. I won't go into that too much, but he ends up fleeing, and that's why he ends up living in Versailles rather than Paris. But when he becomes king, he had the ramparts of Paris, the city walls demolished. But in compensation for Parisians, he created these open spaces for people to promenade. And over time, of course, these became big social spaces. And by the time of the Belle Epoch, these are the places where people went, as you rightly say, Adam, to be seen and to promenade and to observe and to observe the life of the streets and to observe people and the way they're dressed and the way they're conducting themselves. It's where a lot of the great cafes are. It's where the theaters were. And later on, cinemas. And to this day, actually, it's where you're going to find cinemas. The Théâtre du Boulevard. The theater of the boulevard is a term that Parisians use, just as a New Yorker, for example, might say Broadway theater, or a Londoner might say West End theater. So the boulevards is a place of entertainment, as a place of sociability, but also as a place for a figure called the flaneur. The flaneur was somebody who wandered the streets for leisure, for pleasure, not really kind of immersing themselves or thinking that they're not really immersed themselves as part of the spectacle, but they're watching it and almost kind of casting a critical eye on it, just taking pleasure from observing human life flood past. So the boulevards were the place were the place for that. And these are the places, which have kind of glorious street lighting, your Morris columns, which are those little columns which have theatre publicities plastered onto them. It's where you get your newspaper kiosks and everything like that, cafe terraces. It's a place where all human life can be observed and be on display. Nowadays, of course, they're just really busy with traffic quite a lot. But back then, back in the Belle Epoque, it was the place which travel writers commented on. Some of the sources I used for the book, that this is the place. You want to see old Paris, this is where you go. It's fascinating.
And I wish that I could go back in time and experience it before the emergence of the automobile to a large extent, because I think that would have been something. But when you see sort of the paintings of Paris with the Seine and then the sweeping boulevard to the side, like that's kind of what you imagine from this period. And it's so picturesque. But getting back to modernity for a second, you talk about in the book the emergence of the department store, which is not what you think about when you think about Paris. You think about high fashion and those sorts of things, but you don't necessarily think about what is becoming a very new idea in the turn of the 20th century, that will have this large area with a bunch of different shops and stores in it. And so this is the emergence of a whole new kind of shopping culture. And anytime that you have something new that's emerging, you are going to have proponents and you are going to have opponents. So I'm interested to ask you, what did people think about it at the time? Like, did Parisians see this as almost an insult to their culture and the ideas, or was it something that they were willing to explore and be willing to be receptive to?
I think it's a kind of a very mixed balance sheet on that score in terms of the Parisian response. Some people loved it, obviously. I mean, it was quite exciting. It's a place where it's a kind of a place where goods from all across the country, across Europe, in some cases all across the empire, can be brought in this one place. You get the mail, you get mail order, you get deliveries across the city. The first department store, the Bon Marché, actually created in the Second Empire, so before the Third Republic, before the period writing about in the book, has its own kind of special conveyor belt for its delivery system, kind of like a forerunner to our online retailers today. You see photographs of these these massive warehouses, online retailers. Well, the Bon Marché was so proud of it that it even issued a postcard. This is what it looks like. This is really modern, and this is feeding consumerism in modern consumerism in a way that we that we've never been able to do before. It's also was a place where women, especially middle class women, could go virtually unchaperoned. One of the very few public spaces, because department stores were often explicitly aimed at women. Zola's novel, Au Bonheur des Dames, sometimes translated as The Lady's Paradise, is brilliant on this. He kind of almost satirizes the department store owners, Mouret's view. He says, I'm going to subjugate women by trying to harness their desires, their acquisitive desires, and so on. It's quite kind of sexist, actually, the way Mouret kind of views women as people to be kind of to excite their acquisitive desires, and then to kind of really kind of exploit that and fleece them of their money. But for many women, these were social spaces where they could actually kind of relax. For middle class women, the customers, these places some of them had cinemas. Some of them, one even had an orchestra. They had reading rooms for newspapers. So they were kind of social spaces, rather like modern day shopping malls, which don't just have shops, but have the things like cinemas and cafes and things like that. This is it. They all had restaurants and cafeterias where people could go and gather and have something to eat. So they're very, very modern in that sense. And so some people were very excited by this. And actually, some of the people who worked there, for women in particular, like lower middle class women or Parisian-born women, who had certain levels of education and literacy and numeracy, these offered new employment opportunities, which been around beforehand, where domestic service or service in smaller, lesser paid retail institutions, or even factory work might have been, the future, or workshop work. These were often had better terms and conditions. It's important not to overstate this. These were still very exploitative conditions, especially by modern standards. But nonetheless, it did excite some kind of enthusiasm. Critics, though, were worried about, okay, well, what about this, as you say, what about how is it going to upset Parisian traditions? Your small retailer, your small independent retailer were threatened, and some go out of business because they cannot compete with the pricing, pricing strategies and marketing strategies of the department stores. It's absolutely tragic. So for many retailers, actually, this is a horror. For a lot of the people who work in the department stores, I've just talked about how, in one level, there are benefits to it, especially for women, but the hours are very, very long. They're kept under watch for a long, long time. And often you find that when workers start to organize into trades unions, when the socialist movement gathers pace, you start to see campaigns to try to improve pay and conditions within working in the department store. So there are people on the political right. They're worried about this kind of consumer society, which is somehow sapping the moral fiber of people, turning them away from real values. And on the left as well, on the Republican left, there's a sense of, well, this consumer society is distracting people from, civic virtue. The urge to, is basically sapping their moral fiber, their civic fiber, preventing them from being good Republican citizens, engaging in politics and so on and so forth. So it's a really mixed balance sheet, it has to be said. But the buildings themselves, I have to say, are well worth a look today. There's a lot dated this period.
Yeah, even in some American cities, you go to the old called arcades. In some senses, they're actually quite beautiful. They're not box stores in the way we might think of them today. And of course, we're still arguing over shopping and shopping malls to this very day about whether or not it's destroying the, quote unquote, mom and pop stores, and whether it's good for American fiber too. And this is not a conversation that has gone away by any stretch of the imagination. I'd say for a long time, the dollar ruled, and so stores are winning. But right now, they're kind of at a low ebb. So it's about how do you continue to deal with changing market trends? That always is going to happen. I want to ask a little bit about Montmartre, the Bohemian enclave, because I think when a lot of people think about Paris at the turn of the 20th century, this is one of those things that they have a lot of questions about, and I do too. And it plays an interesting role in the book. In fact, you write of Montmartre that art and anarchy marched hand in hand. And I think that that's really interesting, because that is, of course, what we think when we think about this particular Bohemian enclave. So I thought you could give us a little bit of background about it. What role does this play in Paris during this time period? What did Parisians think about it? What did others think about it? Who went there and why? All of these questions are, I think, things that our listeners and everybody else just kind of wonders about when we hear this word.
Well, when I started writing about Montmartre, I suddenly realized, like a lot of people who go to Paris quite a lot or have lived in Paris, you don't go to Montmartre. You usually avoid Montmartre because you think it's just full of tourists, right? I mean, you're a tourist yourself, really. You're a visitor to the city anyway. But I was a bit hypocritical. I'm not going to go. It's full of tourists. I'm a tourist myself, right? But anyway, and I suddenly realized if I'm going to write about the streets and the topography, I better go. So I did, and it's beautiful. Actually, it's great. I mean, it was busy. It was a Saturday. Had a long wander around again, just refreshing my memory. And it's worth a visit. I mean, it's just beautiful. I mean, not just Sacré-Cœur and all that, but the streets themselves are just absolutely spectacularly beautiful. But this wasn't what it was always like. The point about Montmartre, and the reason it developed into this kind of bohemian enclave, is precisely because it was untouched by the urban renovations that are normally associated with Baron Haussmann, the creation of the big boulevards, which you just talked about, and so on, and big avenues, and so on and so forth, that with which he's associated, and then subsequent renovations. And it's partly because of the topography. I would sort of give a warning that if you were to visit Montmartre and you've not been before, be prepared for a good cardiovascular workout because the streets are very steep. In some cases, that innocent-looking street on the map is a very steep and long staircase. So just be warned. Not for the faint-hearted sometimes. But the point of this is the kind of the development of modern amenities and so on associated with Parisian modernity in this period pretty much passed Montmartre by in many ways. The result was, though, that rents were cheap. There was even an area at the center of Montmartre, long since disappeared now, called the Maquis, which is kind of like this kind of semi-rural area with absolutely no, like a shanty town in the middle of it where people graze pigs and chickens and things like this, and lived almost like this kind of countrified existence. It sounds bucolic, but it's obviously grindingly poor as well. So with the cheap rents, you get artists, right? Struggling artists live there, but also anarchists. Right, anarchists who reject property ownership and so on. They often gather together in these little sort of small communes and so on and so forth. And the Montmartrois themselves, the residents of Montmartre, see themselves still, in many ways, as kind of outside Paris, as not quite Parisian. And this is something that the famous cabaret in Montmartre, the Chat Noir, the Black Cat, played a lot on. It issued its own magazine called the Chat Noir, the Black Cat. And it often kind of made a big joke about this, that we're sending delegates into explore the wider world because Montmartre is the most important place on the planet. Therefore, we need to find out more about the rest of the world. We might even go as far as Paris, so Paris is being somehow different. But that's exactly what they're playing on, because what they're playing on is the fact that they want to, artists, cabarets, the places like the Moulin Rouge, for example, the Chat Noir, the Mirliton, these famous cabarets, which you see on posters around every day in the tourist shops, could not have existed without a properly Parisian, often middle-class clientele spending money. Artists needed to sell their paintings. So on the one hand, this kind of bohemia had to present itself and in some ways be outside mainstream society, mainstream taste. But at the other hand, it couldn't exist without it. It needed the support. It needed the clientele. It needed the audiences. It needed the viewers and purchasers of paintings and artwork, right? The buyers of magazines and things like that. On the other hand, politically, if you were a bohemian, an artist living in Montmartre, one of the whole points of that lifestyle was that you challenged bourgeois taste, the prevailing aesthetics, the prevailing middle-class tastes. And so a lot of artists are also, therefore, anarchists as well. Camille Pissarro, Paul Signac were both politically anarchists. They don't live in Montmartre, though. But Théophile Steinlen, the great draftsman, was. So too was Kees van Dongen, who did live in Montmartre, lived in the Bateau Lavoir alongside Picasso. And for Kees van Dongen, art and anarchy marched hand in hand. He actually said, we were anarchists without throwing bombs, precisely because the art that they produced was also meant to challenge bourgeois assumptions and bourgeois ideas, just as anarchism was meant to do the same, to challenge bourgeois social assumptions as well. It's perhaps a willfully idealistic, perhaps willfully naive looking back on it, but that's what was said at the time.
Well, this was a time period, too, where you have a lot of different intellectual and political movements that are going on, and things today that in a lot of areas would never be tolerated. Discussions of anarchism and so on and so forth you'd probably be branded a terrorist and put on some sort of watch list for participating in this sort of organization. But that wasn't the case back then. But that's your answer to that was a great sort of segue to my last question, which is about social stratification, because of course, we've talked about the broad sweeping boulevards of the Seine, and we've discussed Notre Dame, and we've discussed the Eiffel Tower, and we've discussed a lot of the beautiful parts of Paris. But not everybody gets to experience those parts of any city. There are different individuals who live in different areas. Not everyone is as wealthy, and they can't go to the department stores, or maybe they work in the department store, but they can't shop at the department store. So what sort of social stratification still existed in Paris at this point in history? And how did different groups experience modernity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we associate the Belle Epoque, not unreasonably actually, with the glories of the Belle Epoque. We've talked about the Eiffel Tower, the Sacré-Cœur. We've talked about art, cabaret, the bohemian lifestyle of Montmartre and so on. But it is one of the most unequal societies as well. A striking statistic is on the eve of the First World War, some 10% of the French population, 10% of the French, 10% own about 90% of the nation's wealth. The distribution of wealth in what is actually a very, a very kind of robust, prosperous economy, generally speaking, in terms of, production and productivity, in terms of what it produced as well, the kind of, especially the luxury high-end goods and so on and so forth, in terms of its embrace of technology at the time, is genuinely shocking. I mean, and to kind of illustrate that further, about 70% of Parisians at the same time, on the eve of the First World War, when they died, were so poor that they left nothing of real value to their children. Okay, they just don't own enough to pass on any kind of legacy to their children. The result is, to answer your question, is that different groups of Parisians experience modernity, or the Belle Epoque modernity that we've been talking about, in different ways. The kind of Paris of Marcel Proust, the cafe society, the salon, the parties, the carriages, we are talking about, that top 10%, and maybe a little bit broader than that. For most people, though, life is a daily grind. And when you think that for Parisians, Paris was still a manufacturing city, but not with factories. We're talking about small-scale workshops. We're talking about people doing a lot of home working, producing stuff at home and then selling it on, or doing producing part of something in their home and then passing on to somebody else to do the next stage of manufacturing whatever it is. The result was that these people were very, very vulnerable to downturns in the market, to seasonal fluctuations as well. And it meant that a lot of Parisians really struggled at certain times of year, struggled to feed themselves, especially if they had a family. You find often that the poorest people were widows. Women who lose their husbands, especially at a young age, still have children. And because women were paid less, a lot less than men, for doing often exactly the same kind of work, they are really, really struggling in these periods of downturn, and often just struggling just generally. So there's a great deal of poverty, and people remarked on this at the time. And we're not just talking about socialists and anarchists. People said, "Oh my gosh, there is these whole areas of Paris where poverty is just to be seen everywhere." And some of the sources are really very, 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 very striking. The have-nots were often, especially as a result of the urban renovations of the 19th century, pushed outwards. So to places to the north and to the east. Montmartre, we've mentioned, but there are whole areas like the 19th arrondissement just to the east of Montmartre, Belleville, Ménilmontant, the 20th arrondissement in the east, but also the sort of the southern outskirts of the city too. And these places are slum areas at the time. And very often you find that the younger generation fall into criminality. There was a bit of a moral panic. Actually, not unreasonable moral panic. I'm suggesting that it was just all paranoia, but there are gangs of Apaches. They call themselves Apaches because they're meant to be kind of wild gangs of young criminals who subsisted on mugging, on pimping, on prostitution, and so on and so forth. And the police have a really hard time getting a handle on them. Prostitution itself was rife. We don't know how many women were forced into sex work. Mainly because, while some registered with the police as they were meant to in theory, many didn't want to, because once you register with the police, that was a mark against your name for life, most likely. But some estimates go as high as 120,000 people, women, were involved in sex work, often on a very casual and therefore also on a very dangerous basis. Housing conditions were not as they should have been. tuberculosis hit about half of all Parisian households. And the situation got so bad that round about the turn of the century, the city government, the Paris Commune, the Paris municipality rather, actually designated 6 areas as îlots insalubres, insalubrious islets. These were particular blocks which were where the mortality rate from tuberculosis was so catastrophically high, they decided they had to do something about it. Now, there were some minor improvements. So, for example, the introduction of the main drain. It sounds like a very silly, mundane, a bit gross innovation, but the main drain to kind of get rid of all the household waste. It's to connect it all so that people weren't kind of getting rid of their effluent and their household waste, in the street or in open gutters. But by the outbreak of the First World War, only 10% of houses had that. That took time to develop. By the outbreak of the First World War, only half of all Parisian houses had their own toilets. Otherwise, they were shared. It's things like that. The conditions were really ghastly for a lot of people, and that kind of belies often the beauty, the undoubted beauty of a lot of what we see as the Belle Epoque. Another point to remember, the final point I would say, is women. Women in general, whatever class, were second-tier citizens. They didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have access to the same employment rights or employment full stop as men. When they did have employment, even when they performed the same kinds of tasks men were performing, they were paid a lot less, sometimes 50% of what men were paid for doing the same type of work. Their place in families and society was meant to be subordinate legally. There were improvements. Women gradually were given legally control over their earnings, over their savings. They were eventually allowed to open bank accounts and so on and so forth. Some things changed for the better for women. A greater diversity of employment, for example, the changing nature of women's work. With the modernization of the economy, the introduction of new structures of banking, finance, postal work, for example. The department stores you talked about created a diversification of employment for women with certain skills. So that kind of made life a bit better for people. And the bicycle. The bicycle made mobility. You couldn't be chaperoned on a bike, right? So if you're a middle-class woman, you couldn't be chaperoned. That gave women a bit more freedom of mobility, which they hadn't hitherto employed. So much so that one of the feminist congresses that Marguerite Durand, for example, attended, actually gave a toast to the bicycle because they saw it as a kind of a feminist, a symbol of women's liberation, which I think is a nice point to end on. But otherwise, we're talking about improvements for women, but really just baby steps.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I say when we go to the past, when we look at the past, we're like travelers and we take our bags with us. And our bags are our ideas and the views at which the world should function. And we have to remember that that's not the way that it was, that this Paris may look quite modern to us when we look at parts of it from the facade. But the reality is, it still had a long way to go in terms of its society to get to where we are today. Like this is a work in progress. The world was a work in progress still very much then. This was still an age we talked about at the very beginning when it was thought to be okay to have an empire. Like nobody, in fact, you thought it would be strange if you didn't, or it meant that you would be weak. So these were very, very different times. Political culture, political ideology was very different from our modern sense. So even as we can start to see the great buildings of these modern cities coming into being, the people who build them had a different mindset and had a different ideological view. Well, we've talked about a lot of different things. Obviously, there's a lot more in the book that we don't have time to get into today. Otherwise, we'd be here all day, which I would enjoy. But I don't think anybody wants to listen to an 8-hour-long podcast. So what I'll have to tell you is if you've been interested in any of the subjects that we've discussed today, pick up a copy of the book. If you're listening to this now, it is available today because that's when we release it, the day that it's available. And as I mentioned before, you can just click the link in the show notes and it'll take you right to where you can purchase it. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we close today? Anything that I missed that is absolutely essential for our listeners to hear?
Well, one thing is the Dreyfus affair. scandal, one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in modern history, which blew up this Franco-French war in ways which made it very, very shrill and very, very divisive, and which echoed deep into the 20th century. That's in the book as well, but it's a very long, albeit fascinating story. But thank you, Adam. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yes, it's been a great interview. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate the conversation.
No, thank you. Hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you, Adam. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for having me.